Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this is the New Movie Diary, in which I tell you about new, recent, and up-and-coming releases and try to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. I'd also like to wish everybody a happy and circumspective June 19th. As it so happens, this was another one of those cases where I'm kind of stumbling into appropriate movie selections rather unintentionally, just as with what happened 2 weeks ago when I saw Giuseppe Fiorello's fireworks at the beginning of Pride Month. This week, this past Thursday, I decided to take in a double feature of two new releases, beginning with driving all the way up to the landmark Ritz in Philadelphia for The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, a new horror film by first-time feature film director Bomani J. Story that first started its limited release rollout last week, and then taking my butt back down to Burlington's Regal to see the first showing of The Blackening, a new horror comedy directed by the prolific journeyman director Tim Story. And before you ask, no, I do not believe that there is any relationship between these two gentlemen, or at least I can't discover any interview or journalistic evidence that this is the case. It's just two gentlemen filmmakers who happen to be named Story. Look, I swear, I am actually accidentally doing some of this. I did totally by accident end up deciding on seeing these movies and then realizing, oh, this video will probably be coming out on Juneteenth. That's opportune. And yeah, I did deliberate that I was going to do a double feature of black horror movies, because why not? I got two black horror movies out this week. Why do I gotta choose? Let's do the duo. I am not, however, crazy enough to deliberately see two films by two fellas named Story. That's just how it happens. Just two movies by two guys named Story. Two stories, man. This video's not only too long, it's two stories. Anyway, first up, The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster. This is Bomani J. Story's first feature film as a director. It is not, however, his first feature film project. That would be a neat little independent picture from 2018 called Rocksteady Row, for which Story wrote the original screenplay. Rocksteady Row is a really interesting and I think on balance a pretty fun little movie. It's very heavily a kind of pastiche movie. Basically, the skeleton of Story's screenplay is almost beat for beat Yojimbo and A Fistful of Dollars, but then there are also elements that feel like homages to The Warriors and Mad Max 2 a little bit, and all filtered through this kind of fantastical post-apocalyptic college setting, sort of like a post-apocalyptic riff on 80s college comedies in a way. Now, I thought Rocksteady Row is about 50% stuff that I find totally brilliant, and about 50% stuff that I think just doesn't really escape the shadow of its only really being a pastiche and never really feeling like a real movie unto itself. It's really got a college movie feel, and not in the sense that it takes place at a college, but that its perspective, its production value, though really quite good, feels a little college-y, by which I mean a little rough, a more proof of concept feeling, a little narratively and aesthetically juvenile and derivative, a little too cool for school in its attitude, not really working as well dramatically as it has the potential to be, kind of being distracted by higher concept stuff that has been done much better elsewhere, particularly by so many of the genre texts that it's extrapolated from. But one thing I can say about it is that of that 50% of it that I think is utterly brilliant, a lot of that comes down to Story's screenplay. He really did demonstrate such a classic sort of exploitationeer's tact for writing a tight, gripping, kind of lurid picture that has this really unique oratory nestled in all of its dialogue, which the cast of the film chews on pretty hard, and to great success. I'm not bagging on that aspect of it. I like how much scene chewing there is, and I like how Story's screenplay gives over to scene chewing, lets his actors revel in the sort of heightened affair of things. So I was very much looking forward to seeing the angry black girl and her monster after feeling that Rocksteady Row was really quite promising to see Story's progression from just screenwriting to now also directing from his own screenplay. And in this case, as with Rocksteady Row, there is a heavy layer of self-aware pastiche going on in The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster. The film stars Laia De Leon Hayes as Vicaria, a 17-year-old girl living in a low-income housing complex in the suburbs of Charlotte, North Carolina, where the film was shot on location. Vicaria is a very precocious, confident, and intelligent young woman. She attends a mostly white STEM charter school, but there is a dark side to her character. Having first lost her mother at a young age to gun violence and then her older brother Chris in a gangland shooting, Vicaria develops a monomaniacal obsession with the idea that death is not an endemic organic phenomenon, but a disease that can itself be cured or reversed. After her brother's death, this obsession leads her to take away his body, to hide it in a laboratory and workshop she has made for herself in a condemned building behind her housing complex. And without losing much time at all, the film establishes that Vicaria has been snatching the bodies of black men who have died in her community and using their body parts to restore her brother Chris's body, with the intention of using a machine she has built, which in her notebooks she calls the Prometheus, to use this machine to revive her brother by means of sudden surge of electricity. Now, if this premise is striking you as rather familiar, it should be said that The Angry Black Girl is not only loosely inspired by, but is a rather direct adaptation of the classic Mary Shelley novel Frankenstein, or The Modern Prometheus. Story is fairly cheeky in his allusions to this fact. Vicaria has even titled her notebooks The Modern Prometheus, a direct allusion to the subtitle of Shelley's novel, and also an interesting bit of subtle character building, because one immediately wonders if, in the context of the story, Vicaria is already prefiguring herself as the modern Prometheus, a heroic figure who brings down the fire of the gods to man, and one also wonders if she's really following through to the end of the Prometheus myth, what that actually happens to Prometheus at the end of the story. The rooting of the character's trauma and obsession in the death of her family members, especially her mother at a young age, also rather directly extrapolated from Shelley's novel. There are several other scenes that reinterpret and overlap with the dramatic beats of Shelley's novel quite nicely, though obviously being radically reinterpreted through the lens of a socially conscious critique of contemporary American poverty and systemic racism. I should also mention that while it's not explicitly stated, Vicaria is literally Frankenstein. On her notebook, she credits her name as Vicaria F., and at one point her father, Donald, played by Chad L. Coleman, attributes the name to a German who branded their ancestors with his own name. Obviously, the slave owner who owned their ancestors and enslaved them. And it's honestly pretty fun to contemplate the two different possible canons of this little independent film, whether we should take it totally as its own contained adaptation of Frankenstein, or if there's a way of looking at it as a kind of self-aware sequel to Frankenstein, doing what many a Frankenstein movie has done, both direct sequels and other films that have featured scientists named Frankenstein, and suggesting that this modern take on the story is part of a grand continuity and a legacy of evil in popular literature and cinema that is all interwoven indirectly. Anyway, Vicaria does successfully revive her brother Chris, now the creature or monster. He is played by Edom Atsuswanzi, but as in the classic Frankenstein mold, it isn't long before the violence and adversity that this scared, traumatized, misbegotten wretch experiences precipitates a series of gruesome killings. One really interesting twist of Story's take on Frankenstein here is that Vicaria actually seems to know immediately what she wants to use her monster for once she has it. She's not revolted or horrified by the sight of her creation like the canonical Victor Frankenstein was. She's actually like, okay, I know what you're going to help me do. You're going to help me sabotage and take revenge on the drug-dealing blood gang that is poisoning our community. So they attempt to steal some drugs drugs from a local runner named Curtis, Jeremy DeCarlos. They get caught, and in the ensuing altercation, Chris, the creature, violently chokes Curtis and smashes his head against the ground, and Vicaria runs away, but not before being spotted by a machete-carrying enforcer named Jamal, played by Keith Holliday. Nobody really believes Jamal when he claims that there's some kind of monster prowling around their community, but obviously Vicaria's actions don't sit well with Kango, the leader of the project's Bloods, played by Denzel Whitaker. So in addition to the bodies of Kango's gang members piling up, as well as the deaths of several cops, basically very quickly hits the fan, and now Vicaria is caught between a rock and a hard place, between Kango's gang and her conflicted desire to both protect her brother, but also her recognition of the unique danger he poses to not only herself, but to her family. So I should say right off the bat that once I started to realize how much The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster was not simply a riff on, but a rather direct adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, I was very much enthusiastic and on board with it. For people who love and appreciate Frankenstein as this seminal text of gothic horror and scientific romance, there really is just kind of a nerdy joy in teasing apart how the layers of story screenplay are not just riffing on the content of Shelley's novel, but really rather explicitly playing with and adapting the various interwoven themes of Shelley's novel, whether it's obsession, or the line between brilliance and madness, or the Greek tragedy of a heroic, or rather an anti-heroic figure who touches unprecedented mortal greatness, but at the price of everything they hold sacred. And I only really emphasize that point because I feel like there's going to be a lot of people who are dismissive of how explicitly polemical Story's screenplay is. There really isn't a clean division between text and subtext in this movie. This is not just a politically conscious movie, but a film in which pretty much all of the characters, from Vicaria to her father to even Kango, the gang leader, are rather erudite and socially conscious, and where the violence of the story is framed as the result of systemic forces operating not in the background, not implicitly, but in the foreground, as an explicit part of what informs the characters' motivations and conflicts and actions. And there's going to be a lot of jaded or cynical folks, I think, that unfortunately are going to be rather crassly dismissive of this tact of Story's film, in the imagined sense of this being a scandalization of Shelley's purer, apolitical novel. So let's just be clear from the outset, Frankenstein is not an apolitical novel. Mary Shelley was not an apolitical writer, and her writing is not very subtle in its own context either, and it is expressly political in its critique of modernity and what she identifies as the cruelty and adversity that the monster experiences, as this character who literally has an entire section of the novel where he explains point blank and very verbosely how he's a product of his environment, how he's been turned into a monster because of the way he was abandoned and the way society treats him. So there's no getting around the political and polemical features of Story's films, and the ways in which I'd argue that it's one of the few Frankenstein adaptations that actually takes that polemical perspective of Shelley's novel seriously, and not just in some vague, oh, you shouldn't tamper in God's domain gothic stuff, because I think what Story is able to get by adapting the skeleton of this story into this contemporary context is that he's able to identify a sympathy for the character of the Mad Doctor as a political and not just a horrific gothic character. Because the classic Mad Doctor story is usually always premised on the idea of the Doctor's madness being the result of aberration, of a distorted or spiritually deprived or even psychopathic way of seeing the world and their purpose within it. Whereas I think what's very interesting about the character that Story and Hayes craft here is how it probes the possibility of framing the Mad Doctor as not just some insane random actor, but as rather someone who has gotten to where they are in their life precisely because they themselves were dismissed and condescended to and marginalized, and therefore their ideas not nurtured in a holistic way, so that they take on this horrific domino effect of violence and destruction. And don't get me wrong, the angry black girl isn't some namby-pamby sob piece. This movie's got teeth, and it's actually an interesting question why Story decided to title the movie The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster as opposed to The Mad Black Girl and Her Monster. Because that's the sort of very compelling duality of Vicaria's characterization and the mixed connotations of both of those words, angry and mad. Because obviously, in some ways, both descriptors would themselves be allusions to a misogynistic stereotype of black women, of the angry or mad black woman. Whereas in the film, there's this much more nuanced emotional and psychological interplay between the notions of both madness and anger as forming the basis of Vicaria's motivations. And one of the more interesting and challenging things about this movie is the way in which Story doesn't really render a judgment on where that line is to be drawn, and even to a certain extent, while he might treat Vicaria empathetically, he doesn't necessarily portray her sympathetically. Quite frankly, one of the most disturbing aspects of this horror movie really is as a study of this character, where right up to the end, the perspective of the filmmaker is so non-judgmental, and therefore, because it's non-judgmental, it's rather deeply ambivalent of everything she does and that she accomplishes. All leading up to this major climactic deviation from Frankenstein, where on the one hand, it has a kind of fairy tale optimism to it, but there's also so much potential for unspoken horror that Story just leaves us with in just this pooling sense of disturbance and profound dread about what could be possible. Technically speaking, I think the film is quite accomplished. I really appreciate that it seemed to be shot on film. Daphne Chin-Woo's cinematography of this film just has such an incredible, crisp, granular texture to it. There are aspects of Story's direction that aren't quite up to snuff, and I do have to say that the least effective horror aspects of this movie do end up being the more obligatory jump scares and moments of violence, which is unfortunate because one thing Story is really good at depicting, and which a lot of credit is due to the special and visual effects team on this picture, particularly practical and makeup effects, one thing Story is really good with is the horror of aftermath, and quite frankly, he's so good at it that you kind of just end up wishing he invested more in just the aftermath of violence as this crux of the film's most visceral and disturbing moments. Whereas when it comes to action itself, he relies on rather cheap and unconvincing fast-cutting techniques, and again, a lot of jump scares, which again get really old and really repetitive and are quite predictable each and every time they occur. It's definitely tough because I think The Angry Black Girl is very much a part of this growing tradition in black horror, where there's this unmistakable tension between the interpretation of horror as a genre in which we extrapolate human fears and anxiety through metaphor or allegory. The tension between that and then the realization that black life in America is such that what exists only in the imaginary for a white audience is simply a day-to-day reality. Story is very good at portraying aftermath. He's also very good at portraying the terror leading up to horror. But when it comes to the most horrific and disturbing aspects of the film, they all end up being social horrors, realist horrors, not the horror of the creature or the mad science or the more spectacular, violent events in the film. There's this incredible sequence in the middle of the movie where Vicaria is just having dinner with her family, and there's this great terrifying build up to the idea that at any moment Chris is gonna make some kind of horrific appearance, and then you hear this loud banging at the door, but it's not Chris, but the police investigating the death of an officer. You never see the officer in the scene, you only hear his voice, but just the tension of this black family on the opposite side of this door, trapped in their own home, and then just hearing this frustrated officer slamming on their door door one more time before he leaves, just to let them know how much he resents them. It's suffocating for how horrific it is. But then Story does something even more amazing, which is that he shows us how it is that a pair of black adults, particularly Vicaria's father, after such a traumatic event, attempts to create levity, to get everyone's mind off of the horror that just happened, and then succeeding and getting everyone to be laughing and having a good time, except that for us as an audience, just seeing this tonal transformation only makes the scene all the more disturbing. We may be used to seeing scenes kind of like this in the context of social dramas and crime movies, but we're not as used to seeing it so explicitly framed in the context, in the formal traditions of horror film. And it's something that Story, for as much as some aspects of his direction can leave you wanting, it's something that he pulls off with such an incendiary, disturbing force that, far from detracting from our investment in the more heightened, more generic monster movie parts of the film, really just pulls us even further in and gets us to really luxuriate in the ambivalence and the dramatic complexity of the story that's being told. It should also be said that the performances in this film are really good. Laia De Leon Hayes is very good and really striking. A very tight rope that she has to walk in, embodying all of these different aspects of her character, from her brilliance and her really rather immature for her age in the sense of her enthusiasm, but then also her deep anger, and then her just totally obsessive nature, and even her monomania. She's got a lot to shoulder with this part, but she's a revelation as not just a cliche horror final girl lead, but as the more nuanced, dramatic lead that Story's screenplay demands of her. I'd give it a solid 4 out of 5. I may be slightly overestimating it for as amateurish as I feel some of the more cliche shock and horror elements are handled by Story, but I was more or less completely wrapped up in this one from beginning to end. A wonderfully acted, beautifully shot, and really rather excitingly written, juicy story. A very mature and impressive development for Story as a filmmaker. But we've got 2 stories to talk about today, so why don't we tip our hats to the younger Bomani J and shake hands with the elder statesman, Tim Story. For those of you who don't know, Tim Story is a director who has been working since the late 90s, directed a couple of features at the end of the decade, but really cut his teeth doing music videos before he kind of had a low-budget breakthrough when he directed Barbershop, which was released in 2002. He then directed Taxi, produced by French auteur Luc Besson and starring Queen Latifah and Jimmy Fallon, and besides all that, being easily one of the worst movies that has ever been made. But let's not linger on that one too long, because while most sane people can look at Taxi and perceive the rather bleak, occult horribleness of it, some suits at Fox who produced the film saw what Story could do and said, hey, you're a really proficient director who can do spectacle. Do you want to direct the Fantastic Four? That's right, Story directed both Fantastic Four films, which, while they're not particularly fondly remembered now, I think if we're honest and really look back on them with charitable eyes, they're actually fairly prescient of where superhero films were going at the time. Story's direction is very consummate, but not very stylized in the way that preceding superhero movies often were, thinking of Raimi's Spider-Man films and Ang Lee's Hulk in particular. And the content of the movies is very much a kind of mix between very 4-quadrant safe action fantasy and then portraying the superheroes themselves as basically just colorful sitcom characters, which would pretty much define superhero movies for the next few decades after Iron Man hit and the MCU fever really started to take hold, whereas Fantastic Four and its sequel were kind of, I think, unfairly forgotten for as prescient of that entire much beloved aesthetic as they were. For story, though, these two films were major commercial breakthroughs for him, and at the time, at least with the success of the first one, being at the helm of a superhero blockbuster that would have made him one of the most successful black filmmakers at the time, and really in American film history, if we're being serious. In the interim, Story hasn't really returned to big budget blockbusters, but he's been rather consistently racking up hits, such as both Think Like a Man films and both ride-along movies. He also directed the latest Shaft reboot. But for lack of a more elegant way of putting it, he doesn't only make black films, scare quotes. In fact, his most recent enterprise before this new film, The Blackening, was that new Tom and Jerry movie that Warner Brothers made in 2021. He directed that. It's really interesting because Story really does have such a long, varied, and prolific career, and while he's been acknowledged, particularly by the NAACP, he's been nominated twice for Outstanding Direction at their annual Image Awards, once for Fantastic Four and again for Think Like a Man. It's interesting because while he's quite successful as a filmmaker, much like Malcolm D. Lee or Antoine Fuqua, or even Gina Prince Bythewood to a certain extent, Deon Taylor and Stella McGee as more recent examples, like them, you don't often see Story's name canonized to the wider film connoisseur public as an essential black filmmaker. And I think it's precisely because there's often this over-obsession with the idea of directors as auteurs, as unique authorial voices behind films. And while that can be great, especially for this new generation of young and up-and-coming black filmmakers that we see, including Bomani J. Story, for example, or just in the last few years, like Savannah Lee for A.V. Rockwell, or Nick Yatsujusu, or Jordan Peele, or Boots Riley, or Barry Jenkins, or Janixa Bravo. I feel like in film culture, we can get really obsessed with this heroic vision of the authorial filmmaker, that we do sometimes neglect the importance of filmmakers who are like Tim Story, while their works may be quite personal and authorial to them, don't really fit in the boxes of the auteur, are really typified, ironically, by the success of the filmmaker because he remains invisible as an artist and technician, except when we see his name in the credits. And look, that's unfortunate because if Tim Story is the definitive journeyman filmmaker who just happens to be a black man who has managed to be successful with a very diversified body of work in an incredibly racist industry, then even if I think the majority of his movies are rather mediocre on balance, and even if I think one of them is easily one of the worst pieces of crap that's ever been made and should probably be considered some category of a crime, even if I think all that, I'm excited to see a new film by them. And you know, on a personal note, look, guys, it's about time I started to go seeing more normal movies, isn't it? Like, I would love to do nothing but go to New York and Philadelphia every week and see nothing but meditative and cerebral art movies. But if I'm going to be serious as a film critic, I need to actually keep my feet on the ground somewhat and ask myself, why am I spending so much time reviewing movies that oftentimes most of y'all won't be having the opportunity of seeing until weeks or months or even a year from now? I really didn't care to see The Blackening, and in fact, I didn't really care to see any mainstream releases this week because, for the love of God, what are these options? Basically, it was either The Blackening or Elemental or The Flash, and because I'm an utterly crass vulgarian, I said to myself, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna do the contemporary take on the classic exploitation double feature. First up, a contemporary black-themed retelling of a classic horror story done by a young filmmaker whose previous work I deeply respected. And second, what looked more or less like the next variation on Meet the Blacks or A Haunted House or a million other mediocre horror parodies that nonetheless might prove to be just the right populist B-movie picture to pair up with the more artsy, auteur-stamped A picture on my private little double bill. Well, everybody, while I tried going into The Blackening with as open a mind as possible, and while I would like to actually take a random second to just personally personally swear that I will one day take revenge on Mr. Tim's story for his role in the creation of Taxi. Its existence is a pandemonic evil, and nothing short of a swift but brutal death to all involved in its making will purge the earth of its stain. I tried going into The Blackening with as open a mind as possible, and you know, I really liked it. I mean, I really, really liked it. I almost liked it as much as the angry black girl and her monster, and I really liked the angry black girl and her monster. So I guess that I can say two things for Mr. Tim's story, the elder journeyman director. He has both been responsible for one of the single worst movies I have ever seen, and yet, at this late point in his career of general mediocrities, he really has made something quite special here that might even be one of my favorite films of the year so far. Yes, it's a surprise career height for Mr. Tim's story, but let's break it down first. So the setup for The Blackening is that we start off in this beautiful, big house that a bunch of characters have rented for the Juneteenth holiday. Happy Juneteenth. We're introduced to a couple, Sean and Morgan, played by Jay Farrow and Yvonne Orji, who, while investigating the game room of the house that they've rented, discover this board game called The Blackening, the main feature of which is that at the center of the board there is this horrific depiction of a blackface Sambo character who asks the players to pick a card and answer questions themed around black culture in order to progress through the game. Failing to answer the question or play the game, Sean is killed and Morgan is captured by a black-clad, masked assailant. After the cold open, we follow the arrival of Sean and Morgan's college friends. These include Antoinette Robertson as Lisa, Dwayne Perkins, who co-wrote the film with Tracy Oliver as her best friend Dwayne. Dwayne Perkins, Dwayne, nice one. As well as Grace Byers as Allison, Sequel Walls as Namdi, Lisa's ex-boyfriend with whom she's secretly rekindled her relationship with, much to Dwayne's chagrin. There's also Ex Mayo as Shanika, Melvin Gregg as King, and finally Jermaine Fowler as Clifton, a very nerdy character who was not a very close friend of their circle, and no one can seem to understand why Sean and Morgan invited him anyway. Anyway, they end up stumbling upon the game, and what follows is their hellish night of trying to survive the game and trying to figure out who is behind it all. Now, unlike the angry black girl and her monster, The Blackening really is first and foremost a horror comedy. And in that sense, the main drawback of really getting into the film at first is that it takes a bit for the whole ensemble to come together and for the film to really hit its stride where it manages to be consistently funny. And there's certainly an aspect to which a lot of the comedy of the film is not only really on the nose, but even kind of hacky. There's a lot of eye-rolling moments that come from the fact that a lot of the comedy really isn't situational or visual in nature, but is purely dialogue driven. And like a lot of contemporary comedies, the dialogue suffers from a symptom of the characters always being a little too overly self-aware and the jokes leaning heavily on simply making some pop culture reference that in and of itself is just a reference, it's just a nod to something, it's not particularly funny. But even to that extent, it was as the ensemble came together and The Blackening was really accelerating into the meat of its narrative and the centerpiece of it all, which is the sort of chaotic interplay between all of these characters, that I started to suspect that there was actually a little more going on even in those rough earlier moments in terms of how Perkins and Oliver set up the film. A good example of this is how there's this one part of the film as the ensemble is coming together where in the breath of like less than a few minutes, two separate characters in two separate locations make two separate references to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre completely independently of one another. And then there's another really telling repetition of the same joke or reference where I don't know how much of it to attribute to the original screenplay and how much to attribute to improvisation by the cast, but which is nonetheless in the film and therefore a part of it, where as soon as Sean and Morgan discover the game board, Sean's response is like, "What is this Jim Crow?" And then, when the rest of the ensemble finds the same board, of course, one of them says, I think it even is Perkins' character, they say more or less the same thing. This is some Jim Crow. The Blackening as a horror comedy is really a lot less like the Zucker brothers or the Wayans brothers style of parody movies, and more like Scream, where so much of the film as both a comedy and a horror movie, which it turns out the film really does end up increasingly working fairly well as a spectacular horror movie in its own right. What it really hinges upon is this context in which the lexicon of horror movies is so baked into how the characters react and see everything. And so it seems almost as if there's this rather subtle play by the filmmakers to suggest that, yes, these references are hack and unoriginal, but it's these characters who are all on the same wavelength, who are all drawing from the same reference pool, and where no matter what interpersonal conflicts may separate them or bring them into conflict with one another, foreshadows the ways in which they can ultimately come together and hopefully overcome this hellish night they're forced to experience. There's also potentially an aspect of it where exactly what Perkins and Oliver are poking fun at is the idea that real people in a real horror movie situation would all be making the same exact horror movie references. There wouldn't be any originality to what anyone says. Everybody would just intuitively see the situation that they're in and say, all right, I know what this movie is from. This is just like one of those Saw movies. And then a month passes by and another character comes in to die in the same trap, and someone says, man, this is really odd. This is just like that Saw movie I saw. Like, that's what would happen, probably, in real life. And some of you may be saying, well, that just sounds like a really long-winded and pretentious way of excusing the film's lack of originality. And there is a certain extent to which The Blackening at least starts off as no more and no less than a black-themed riff on Saw or various other kinds of horror movies in which characters are hunted down in a single location for unknown reasons. But I really can't stress how quickly you not only really acclimate to the mode of the film, but really I was quite impressed by how, again, not unlike The Angry Black Girl and the Monster, there's not a lot of delineation between text and subtext here. So much of not only the basic conflict of the movie, but also the constant chaotic bouncing back and forth between the characters is so polemical and so explicit in terms of exploring themes of black identity and solidarity across differences, so much about the history of black marginalization within popular culture, but also black power within its own marginalized tradition of American popular culture. I was really impressed by how much The Blackening started to work not just as a comedy, not just as a horror film, and again, some of the horror parts, the shock and terror parts, are even better executed here than in a more definitively authorial context like in Bomani J. Story's film. Not just in the comedy and the horror, but also in the character drama. These characters, despite the sort of contrived, heightened situation they are trapped in, they really do exceed just being the sort of one-dimensional cartoon cutouts and modern-day stereotypes of blackness that the villainous forces of the film clearly want them to devolve into. That's ultimately the central dramatic tension of the film. Will these characters maintain their solidarity, or will the divide and conquer tactic of the game they're forced to play succeed in dividing and conquering them? And I know that all seems rather self-aware and on the nose just talking about it, and even a little tiresomely academic as a way to approach things. But when it comes down to it, what The Blackening benefits from is not only some of the best direction of Tim Story's career, but also a tremendous ensemble cast who are able to look in the camera and say these really self-aware and unsubtle lines and have these debates and these arguments and make you believe it as part of the totally naturalistically credible workings of the film's setting and these characters' relationships. And I don't want that to be undersold, because while good character writing is hard to come by in general, there really is an extent to which where, as a horror fan, I'm used to taking for granted that oftentimes really thin character writing and stock types are just kind of the prerequisites of a popular genre where the expectation, for better or worse, is that they are often just ornaments of a macabre experience where, again, for better or worse, you're kind kind of trained to take joy in the suffering of others for its own vicarious, spectacular, visceral thrill. And while from a more polemical perspective, I can get the point, so to speak, of the blackening specifically, where the point is, no, the purpose of this movie is not to just show a bunch of black folks suffering and getting killed horribly and not making it to the end of the movie. But even putting it in those terms, I think undersells the extent to which that Oliver and Perkins's screenplay really demonstrates what more nuanced character study and drama can do for even the most popularly minded sort of horror movie or horror comedy. And that becomes even more impressive when you consider that the filmmakers set themselves up with no less than 7 major characters, and then all of them pretty much turn out to be so fully explored and fleshed out, and to have their own arcs and evolutions over the course of the film that never feels overly abridged, never feels cheapened, but really gets you to be so consistently invested in and caring what happens to them, not just waiting for the more visceral, spectacular, scary, or funny moments to happen, but waiting for the characters to get in and desperately wondering, oh man, how are they going to get out of this one? That's hard to come by, and it's hard to write, and I think this film exceeds on a lot of levels because of that. And while the comedic aspects of the film are a little rough starting off, I have to say that there are some really ingenious bits of comedy here, even something that happens early on that you think is just going to be a throwaway one-off gag, not only pays off later, but is then subverted in the climax of the movie. I always love to see a running gag not only pay off but then be subverted so late in a picture. There are so many really, really funny moments in this movie, and a lot of small funny moments too. And while I would have asked for a little more visual or situational comedy rather than more dialogue-driven stuff, there's still a lot of nice visual and situational moments. One of the best being where Walls's character is firing a gun and holding it sideways, and then after he misses, Fowler's character ever so quickly just takes Wall's wrists and turns it so that he's aiming the gun correctly, and by then it's too late. I swear to God, I felt like I was dead just seeing that. There are some really brilliant and unexpected moments like that. Again, I wish there was a little more of that, but when it happens, it really, really works really, really well. I went into The Blackening with really rather low expectations, but I ultimately came out of it with the feeling that you get when you really get a fully rewarding, popular cinematic experience. And really what it all comes down to is the combination of a really good screenplay with an excellently defined character focus by Oliver and Perkins, a great, equally portioned ensemble cast, and finally, Tim Story as the consummate journeyman director who is kind of just coming out this summer and blindsiding just about anybody who's been paying attention to his career with maybe even the best movie he's ever directed. I was totally prepared for The Blackening to be the inferior B picture on this impromptu black horror double feature, but quite frankly, I came away from it feeling like it was at least as good as The Angry Black Girl and the Monster, an easy 4 out of 5, which means that it can hang its jersey from the rafters along with some of my other favorite films of the year. It's so funny that I just did my mid-year top 10 list just last week, and then within days I'm seeing 2 movies in a row that have just stolen my heart and slotted themselves right up there at the top of the list. But yeah, The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster and The Blackening, 2 great black horror films, 2 great horror films in general, and both of them perfectly befitting this week of the Juneteenth, not just in terms of a celebration of black history more broadly, but as film lovers, our opportunity to celebrate the history of black cinema with its own unique lexicon and traditions that is still ongoing, still thriving, and still producing such fine works of both both art and popular entertainment. You might have a little trouble finding The Angry Black Girl and Her Monster, but if you can't see both, still highly recommend The Blackening. Wonderful film, great work by pretty much everyone involved. But yeah, I think that's gonna do it for me here. So yeah, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this has been another episode of the New Movie Diary. Once again, happy Juneteenth, and I'll catch you guys next time.